Now, in the South African media space, we see four major groups dominating affairs, even though a number of smaller independently owned titles have had some influence on news and opinion. A few new brands have launched recently with promises of providing an alternative viewpoint. To take a closer look at this landscape and the changes we are seeing is Professor Tawana Kupe, Dean of the Faculty of Humanities at the Wits University. Professor, thank you so much for making the time to join us. Now, from a layperson's view like myself, what we see in the media landscape is an increasing number of players. But what does this mean, not only for South African media, and does it have any implications for the African landscape?
Well, I think in the South African context, it's good that we get more players. Always the expression we have in media analysis is that the more the merrier, that pluralism is important for democracy. Pluralism doesn't necessarily mean, by the way, diversity of content. I'm quite sure we'll discuss that. But as you know, especially those players who get onto the DSTV platform, when we're talking about television or radio, the DSTV Multi-Choice Africa plays on the continent. So anything that South Africans get for those who can afford it on the continent becomes available to Africans as well. And as you know, if you roll back 20 years ago, we didn't have the amount of media we have in South Africa or within the broader context, as you like. The coming in of democracy in South Africa in '94 opened up media space in Africa as well. So to that extent, that is very good. There is always something valuable for audiences and for readers. With newspapers as well, some South African media groups do play on the continent. The Mail and Guidance, for example, has an Africa edition. And also titles like Business Day have titles in East Africa as well as in Nigeria and elsewhere. In broad general terms, when an economy, when a continent needs to have more democracy and better economic play and better economic conditions, one of the indicators is the number, the media available in that space. Let's strip it back a little bit more, Tawan. I mean, if we look at the number of players, yes, those are increasing, but can we say and conclude that this is an indication of democracy when there's very serious questions about the independence and particularly the credibility of very many of those players in the field in South Africa right now? That's an issue, but you know, there's one thing that we must know. Every media outlet has an owner and also a market to play with. That constitutes also room for freedom and also room for censorship. So everyone, if you put it that way, has some credibility issues. Right. But between the credibility issues that everybody has, I think readers benefit something, because I can tell from one channel that I'm not getting the truth that I'm getting from that channel over there. That is why the more the merrier. However, you're quite right in that also one shouldn't also over-celebrate this phenomenon, because what we could have also is a celebration of everyone's bias, and that what we have is growing biases all over the place. Right. Yet what is required really for media to enrich democracy and enrich citizens is that each media outlet be credible in and of its own right, because that is of benefit to audiences. If we take the view of the consumer, and particularly the African consumer, I would assume that we're seeing the largest number of players coming from the South African base. Are Africans on the continent treating South African generated content as credible and credibility in the sense of having the authority to tell the African story? Do South African media have the credibility to tell the African story? Not necessarily, because also one of the things we must be careful about is that there's also expanding media in several markets on the continent. In Kenya, there's Kenyan-owned media. I was there a couple of weeks ago. There's a lot of Kenyan-owned media that has exploded as well. Go to Nigeria, go to Ghana, and so on. However, it is true that South African media has some significance on the continent, partly because of the history of the country and the figure of Mandela and the aspirations Africans have of Africa. But there are also suspicions about how South Africa tells the African story in its own interest. You must remember, media is also about politics and about positioning. So there is some degree of skepticism. Also remember that we must understand one thing. Africa is a continent with two to three major languages, English and French, and then Portuguese. In some of those markets, we don't play very well because our media is actually not in French. And so even if we were credible, even if we were influential, there's a language barrier. And also we don't use on our platforms in South Africa any of the other African languages that play beyond Southern Africa. If, for example, we had media in Swahili, Yoruba or Igbo, some big languages in Western East Africa, then we could be major and significant players. Yeah.
Let's look at editorial integrity. I mean, we've just heard in one of the newspapers today that SABC has been mandated to tell 70% happy news. Now, I'm not quite sure what happy news is, but one gets the sense that it's embroiled in building a good reputation and a good image for the country. To what extent is that an erosion of editorial integrity?
Yeah, no, I think particularly if an owner or a manager tells journalists and editors and producers to please produce a certain amount of happy news, that is editorial interference, and that is not acceptable. And also it can have a boomerang effect. Audiences rejecting that. However, there is also something that to say about that. There's a tendency for certain media actually to only speak about the bad things that happen in a country. If you take a country like South Africa, 20 years as a democratic country, from what the country was since 1652 or in the dark ages of the 1980s, there is a difference. And so some of that difference doesn't always come out of the media. So one shouldn't say 70%. There should be a judicious mixture of the good and the bad, because you can't develop a society by simply saying that all is okay, we are all happy, let's hug each other. There are things that you need to address, but also you can't just tell a bad story.
Let's quickly look at the question of censorship. I mean, I think South Africa would be perhaps on the far end of the spectrum in terms of just allowing different voices to come to the fore. And then we see varying degrees of censorship across the African continent. Are we winning that battle overall?
Difficult to say. It's always a mixed bag. Even in South African context, one could say also there is a phenomena where censorship is creeping in. Government ministers that don't answer questions, give information or delay, and you have to take them to court all of the time to get basic information. But it is true, it's more open space. But actually, if you look at the history of the continent, there's more openness than censorship if you compare it to 20, 30, 40 years ago. And I think because of social media and other technological, digital media, it's getting harder and harder to censor things. And also people are becoming bold